Seth Wood was my uncle, my father's eldest brother. I only knew him from a distance, and he was very eccentric, very a hippie before hippies were known. He was a beatnik before beatniks were known.
There are no pictures of Dad and Seth together, and I never met him, but I was always interested in Seth. He lived such a different life than the rest of the family.
Well, just a few minutes ago I was talking to you. I don't know if I told you anything you wanted to hear or not, but I told you what I thought about it. And I told you what's been my experience, and my experience guided what I said. So, you do whatever you choose to do, huh? Well, I've been having a lot of fun here at the studio, making things for people. Christmas is coming along, and there seems to be a little upswing and stuff here in the studio. See, I'm not a merchant. I'm not a store that sells things. I only sell talent. I design and make things for people. It doesn't matter what. I'm not a merchant because I don't have anything to sell. I'm an artist. I design and create.
Seth was the oldest of 7 children, born and raised at the homestead in Bucknob, Arkansas, next door to Wiley Winfield Scott Wood's place.
Seth also had a half-sister named Bessie, who was 9 years older. She was Fanny's daughter from her first marriage.
Seth must have known his grandfather Wood fairly well, though he was only 7 years old when Wiley died in 1909.
Seth is found with his family in the 1910 census of Scott County, Arkansas.
In February 1912, Seth helped his dad move their livestock overland when the family moved to Oklahoma. Being the oldest son, Seth must have had a large part helping his dad with the cattle, crops, and the large orchard they planted on the south side of the house near Center Point.
About 3 or 4 miles from here when we first come from Arkansas to Oklahoma.
That's 3 or 4 miles south of Center Point.
Yeah.
And how far did y'all have to walk to school?
Well, we walked from there 3 or 4 miles, then further over here when we moved east on our old home place over here. We walked 6 miles.
Remember what crops you raised?
Corn, cotton, cane, watermelon, and a big orchard, all kind of fruits.
How many acres did you have?
We had about 120 acres, I think it was. I don't know. Now, the old house stood right in here somewhere.
Did he own the acres?
Yeah, he owned it. He owned it. The old house stood right in there somewhere.
Seth ran away from home to join the Army when he was 15. World War I was almost over, and Seth was discharged 8 months later, 1 month after the armistice.
Seth was 17 years old when his grandmother Wood passed away in 1919. Grandma Mary lived next door or in the same house as Seth his whole life. Seth would have been very close to his Hallberg grandparents as well. As a boy in Arkansas, these grandparents lived just down the road, and they moved with the Woods to Oklahoma. Seth was 19 when his grandma Hallberg died in 1921, and 23 years old when Grandpa Hallberg died in 1925.
In 1928, Seth is 26 and still living at home when his father John Miner decides to move to Ada and farm. Seth moves too, but he doesn't want to farm anymore. He works in the oil fields 30 miles north of Ada.
Within a year, Seth marries a local girl from Shawnee, Winnie Sharp. She was a school teacher. We don't have any details of the young couple in the early 1930s because they divorced after a few years.
According to the 1940 census, Seth lived in San Antonio in 1935. Cousin Ruby remembers him coming through Ada on his way to California. He was riding a motorcycle with a sidecar.
In 1964, a Sacramento newspaper reporter wrote about Seth's move from Texas to California.
I met a man in Texas, said Seth. He was in the movies and asked me to come to Hollywood, where he had a part for me. I came and I played in some films but had no desire to stay in Hollywood.
Now, both the 1920 and 1930 census show Seth living in Oklahoma, but Seth's version of these years printed in the California newspapers is quite a bit different. A 1963 article reports Seth was a freshman art student at USC in 1920, where he earned a degree in liberal arts. They go on to write that Seth also studied at the Chicago Institute, the Art Students League in New York City, and the Universidad Nacional in Mexico City.
The article lists his former jobs as army man, cook on a lumber schooner, coal miner, photographer, painter, and jewelry maker.
He was a jeweler by trade. He was a photographer by trade, an artist. He lived in California most of his life and never had children.
Ruby doesn't remember anything about Seth attending college, but her dad told a story of a close call mining coal with Seth. There were 2 mines offering work, and the brothers alternated mines every day or two. There was a cave-in one day that claimed the lives of many miners. Luckily, Jim and Seth had chosen the other mine to work that day.
The Marin Independent Journal also wrote in 1964 of Seth's early years.
Seth worked his way through college, turned to sculpture after discovering the art of the natives in the South Seas, where he went on a long expedition as photographer for a botanist.
Parts of these articles are certainly true, especially the ending of one story which reads,
Seth is popular, not only for his work, but for his colorful personality.
Well, Arlie, how did you like the old Red River Valley, huh?
Seth's life is easier to follow by 1938. He is 36 years old when he marries a Jewish girl named Bertha. Bert grew up in Arizona, but left before she finished high school to live with her grandparents in Los Angeles.
Seth and Bert are found in the 1940 census in Los Angeles, where Seth's occupation is listed as actor. 2 years later, Seth's draft card shows him living in San Francisco and working for Bethlehem Steel in the shipyards.
By the end of 1942, Seth and Bert leave downtown San Francisco and move to the hills of Woodacre. This is where Seth had his first art studio, which he called Rocky Hill.
Seth's brother Jimmy moved to California during 1943 to work with him in the shipyards at Sausalito. After a month, Jim sent for Nina and Ruby, who came by train from Oklahoma City. They lived with Seth and Bert at Woodacre for 1 year.
What do you hear from the rest of the gang? Jimmy, have you heard from him? I haven't heard. Well, he did phone me 3 or 4 months ago, but that's the last I've heard. So I think he was working for the city of Denver or something. I don't know. Driving some heavy equipment. I understand he's getting kind of fat and getting some kind of disease from eating too many flapjacks and sugar syrup and Nina's apricot cream pie. God damn, she makes the best apricot cream pie.
Here we lived with Seth in 43 to 44, Seth had a car, my dad didn't. And Saturday was, my dad used to call tight shoe day. And we would go to town to do the grocery shopping. And everybody went. Seth drove. Mama sat where the gears were. Daddy sat in the passenger. And Bert was little, and she sat in Daddy's lap. And behind the seat where the window was is where I laid down to go to town. And when I got too big and my feet stuck out the window, I had to stay home. And my treat was, for staying home, they would bring me a bag of candy of orange slices, which was my favorite.
Their parents, John and Fanny, came by train from Ada during this year for a visit. I believe Seth hurt his back at the shipyards, and by the end of the war, transitioned from part-time artist to full-time artist.
Between 1947 and 1955, Seth has photography studios in Fairfax, San Anselmo, and San Rafael.
In August of 1948, Seth's brother Arlie and family drive to California to visit and look for a job. They stay with Jimmy and Nina. Arlie doesn't find a job, and they return to Oklahoma after just 1 month. In 1956, Seth moved his studio to Sonoma in the Napa Valley.
Anyway, I enjoy life, doing what I want to do. Bert and I get along fine, although I don't go home but once a week, and that's just overnight, Friday night till Saturday morning. Then the climate down there doesn't agree with me. The climate up here is much more beautiful, much lovelier. I don't know where in the world there's any more difference at the same altitude than there is in the 40 miles from down there up here. This is just a different kind of a country entirely.
Seth's work was well known in the region and was displayed often at local galleries, most notably the Torrance Gallery in San Anselmo and the Lucien Labat Art Gallery in San Francisco. He was a regular at the Glad Hand in Sausalito and was known as the blacksmith of the Sausalito Village Fair, where his studio was in 1963.
Every Monday I close up shop and go fishing. We have out in the bay here, we have, down in San Francisco Bay, that is, and then the sloughs and the rivers and stuff around the bay. On a Monday I went out and I caught a 24-pounder. Boy, he was about, must have been about 30 or 34 inches long. Oh, he was a real baby. I had more fun bringing him in.
Uncle Seth would occasionally come to visit my father and mother, and he would often wear shorts and sandals, walked with a cane. He had a beard all the time that I was growing up and knew him. Long silver gray hair, real handsome man. But my father was embarrassed by his long hair, was embarrassed that he wore shorts, and he wore a beret a lot of the time, a black beret. And I remember Linda and I visiting right before I went to Vietnam, and California, went out to his home, and his wife actually went behind the house and dug into the flower bed and brought some canned vegetables out of the flower bed that they had buried there. I don't really know why they had buried them, but they had done so. And we had a short but interesting visit.
Billy was, when he was here for some years ago, he didn't come up here, but he stopped and visited with us, had supper with us down in Woodacre. And he was amazed at the lack of anything green except in the trees, you know. He said, why? There's no green grass. Hills aren't green. I said, well, we live in a semi-desert country here, and it just doesn't get any rain from the end of May until the 1st of October or November. And he was a little bit amazed at that. Oh, by the way, Bertha tells me just now, just before I called you, she told me that Billy and his lady were having themselves a baby over in Germany. So how's it going to feel to have a German grandson or daughter, as the case might be? Huh?
Tragically, Bert is killed in a car wreck during a rainstorm on December 28, 1968.
Well, Seth came to see us, and I wanted to know about Aunt Bert. And he said she died a year ago. He didn't tell anybody. And I wanted to know how she died. And she died in a car on a rainy, slick road and went off the road. And I wanted to know where she was buried or what happened, how he took care of her. And he said he had her cremated, that he took her ashes and went up in a plane and scattered.
So she died in a car wreck in 1969,
Yes.
and Seth didn't call anybody
Or tell anybody.
and it was a year later before you found out.
Seth probably wrote most of his poetry right after Bert's death. The family self-published these poems in 1991.
I just sit around and move tapes and work a little. When I get a job, I finish it up for whoever. I don't get out much. I go to the synagogue on Friday evenings.
Seth marries a Jewish widow named Isabel Siegel in 1970, but they divorce 18 months later.
So I wish that I were going to be here next year, and I'd invite you out, and we'd go up in that country and have a look-see at some of our heritage, if you can call it a heritage. It's getting all filled up with garbage piles and heaps and beer cans thrown all along the highways. It's pretty rugged, let me tell you. I don't like it. I think that's one reason I'm going to Israel next April sometime, if my back doesn't get too bad. I'm moving all my equipment and most of my books and cameras and things, and I'm going to live in Israel for the rest of my 120 years.
In 1972, Seth marries another Jewish widow, Nettie. They eventually made it to Israel together and lived there for about a year. Seth's health deteriorated and they returned to California around 1977. Seth moved into the Veterans Home in Napa Valley, not far from his old Sonoma studio. Ruby remembers visiting Seth there with her parents in the spring of '77. Seth couldn't speak anymore, but he was still alert. Nettie passed away shortly after their visit, and Seth died of a heart attack the next year, 75 years old. His remains were cremated, and he has no cemetery marker.
I've seen an awful lot of life, Arlie, an awful lot of life. The rusty, dirty, nasty, mean sides, and I've seen some of the other side. I like the other side much better.
There was a boy, a very strange, enchanted boy. They say he wandered very far, over land and sea. A little shy and sad of eye, but very